No declaration, no independence, no stars, no stripes, just silence after surrender, and a continent that never became what it almost was. What if the men they now call founding fathers had been forgotten, or worse, remembered only as traitors? What if the world moved on, but the land remained under the crown, held by order, not by choice? Tonight, we'll drift into an alternate version of history, quietly, slowly, without judgment, and wonder what might have happened instead. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and allow yourself to slip into a different timeline where the revolution never succeeded and everything else changed. 1776. The words come before the war. In candlelit rooms far from the front, men speak of liberty and principles, of rights and natural laws, of new beginnings shaped by old philosophies. They argue, draft, and sign. A declaration is written, not in desperation, but in optimism. It names a new country, imagines a new world, and dares to place it on paper before it exists in reality. But outside the chamber doors, the world remains unchanged. The people are not unified. The armies are not ready. The continent is not free. There are no foreign banners flying in support. No fleets from France or Spain rushing to join the cause. There is only a bold claim, standing alone, hoping to become truth through sheer repetition. The declaration is sent into history, but history doesn't blink. The empire doesn't flinch. The army forming around the idea of America is more symbol than force. Regiments are thin. Command is uncertain. Volunteers arrive with their own weapons or none at all. Tactics vary from state to state. Officers are elected. Drills are improvised. Supply lines are broken before they're built. Winter comes early, and with it, disease and desertion. Uniforms are mismatched. Boots are scarce. Ammunition is counted by the dozen. Morale depends on rumor. Across the hills, in towns and farms, support is not unanimous. Many remain loyal to the king. Others simply want to be left alone. Loyalty becomes dangerous, but so does rebellion. The colonies are divided not only from Britain, but from each other. The word united is aspirational. The new flag is still unfamiliar. Even the name America is used hesitantly, like trying on a coat that doesn't quite fit. The British are not in a hurry. Empires rarely are. Their ships move deliberately. Their forces gather across the ocean with precision and planning. They see not a revolution, but a provincial disturbance. And disturbances are managed, not negotiated. At home, Parliament debates punishment, not compromise. In the colonies, British loyalists begin to organize. They meet in secret. They send letters. They remind their neighbors of order, trade, protection. Some inform, some sabotage. The lines blur. One man's rebel is another man's traitor. Communities fracture. Churches split. Families disagree over supper tables. Town militias drill in open fields, but few are prepared for what is coming. The empire is quiet, for now, but it is listening. It is measuring the scope of defiance. And when it answers, it will do so not in anger, but in confidence. By year's end, the shape of the future is already becoming visible. The colonial forces hold no major cities. Communication is slow, confused, incomplete. Newspapers contradict each other. Rumors become facts overnight. Every minor skirmish is called a victory. Every retreat is described as strategic. But those close to the leadership know better. Washington writes of despair. Officers plead for supplies. The French send no reply. The Spanish stay out. The Dutch banks stay closed. What began as a bold experiment is starting to feel like a desperate hope. And yet, no one stops. Pride carries them forward. Belief masks the fear. But in quiet rooms, behind locked doors, some already begin to plan for what will happen when it fails. 1776 ends not with triumph, not with revolution, but with a silence that waits for the empire to respond. And the empire is very good at responding. 1780. The dream ends not with a final battle, but with the slow unraveling of everything that held it together. Defeats have accumulated, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of those still trying to believe. One by one, the victories promised in pamphlets and speeches vanish under the weight of real armies, real hunger, real winter. Forts fall, towns are retaken, supplies are stolen or intercepted. British control expands not with fire, but with silence. Every time a rebel garrison is pushed out, the crown returns with ledgers and flags. The colonies no longer look like a war zone. They look like a map slowly being erased. In the south, loyalist militias grow bolder. In the north, local support thins. The idea of independence, once spoken with reverence, now only survives as rumor. The words of the Declaration are not quoted anymore. They're avoided. The final collapse begins around Yorktown, though few call it final at the time. It's just another repositioning, another effort to hold a line, another message that supplies are running low but spirits are still high. Except the line doesn't hold, and the spirits aren't high, and by the time it becomes clear that no reinforcements are coming, it's already over. The British blockade closes in from the sea. Their infantry advances from the land. Encirclement comes quietly. The last remnants of the Revolutionary Army are outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted. Orders stop making sense. Desertion becomes the only act of agency. And then, one morning, the guns fall silent. There is no grand ceremony, no dramatic surrender, just silence, dust, and a white flag raised without witnesses. The war ends not in spectacle, but in vacancy. Washington is gone. Some say he was captured and executed. Others whisper he fled, or was betrayed, or simply disappeared. His name is not printed again. His image is banned. His words are removed from record. In this world, there are no statues, no monuments, no cherry tree. Franklin and Payne escaped to Europe, scattered across sympathetic courts and cold apartments. Their writings are confiscated. Their names are blacklisted. The revolution itself is redefined, not as an episode of bold resistance, but as an illegal insurrection led by criminals. Public discussion of it becomes dangerous. Schools do not mention it. Newspapers never reference it. Even in private, people avoid the subject. Parents do not pass the story to their children. The silence is not enforced by violence. It doesn't need to be. Failure enforces itself. By the end of the year, the landscape is familiar again, not as it was before, but as the empire prefers. Flags bearing the crown hang above courthouses. Red uniforms patrol the roads. Trade resumes along British lines. Governors are reassigned. Borders are redrawn. The United States are not dismantled because they were never truly built. The phrase disappears from documents. The idea fades. What had once been a declaration becomes a footnote. What had once been a revolution becomes a cautionary tale. In the official record, it is barely mentioned. In the streets, it is barely remembered. And in the minds of those who lived through it, it becomes something else entirely. Not a cause, not a country, but a mistake. 1780 marks the end of something that was never allowed to begin. 1781. With the rebellion over, attention turns not to punishment, but to structure. The empire doesn't seek revenge, it seeks control. Across the former colonies, governors are recalled and replaced with military administrators. Assemblies that once voted on roads and taxes are declared dissolved. Their meeting halls are boarded up or repurposed. Some become barracks, others courts. The language of reform is calm, deliberate, legal. New royal proclamations declare the end of extra-legal governance. The word colony returns to official use. What had been briefly imagined as a nation is now listed in ledgers again, counted not as sovereign territory, but as property. Not a country, an asset. Local leaders are stripped of title. Elections are cancelled. Voting is suspended indefinitely. The justification is simple: stability. And stability does not require debate. Throughout the year, surveys are ordered. Property lines are redrawn. Loyalist claims are prioritized. Land held by suspected rebels is seized. In some towns, entire tracts change hands by signature alone. Ownership becomes conditional on allegiance. Oaths of loyalty are required not just for office holders, but for landholders, merchants, school teachers. Those who refuse are removed. Those who hesitate are watched. Former patriots are offered pardons in exchange for silence. Most accept. A few disappear. The process is not loud. There are no public executions, no mass deportations. Just letters delivered with royal seals and quiet visits from uniformed men. Resistance, where it still exists, fades beneath the weight of paperwork. Appeals are allowed, but only through new imperial courts. The courts do not reverse decisions. They formalize them. The maps change next. Colonial boundaries are softened. Old names remain, but their meanings shift. What was once Virginia is now a military district. What was once Massachusetts is split in two. The continental system of governance is erased section by section, and in its place a cleaner, simpler structure. Royal governors, imperial councils, crown law. Roads are now imperial routes. Ports are imperial gates. The currency is imperial paper. The past is referenced only to highlight errors. The future is described as organized, modern, compliant. Children in schools are taught new civics. They memorize the names of kings and governors, not delegates and generals. Lessons begin with the premise that rebellion was a deviation. That deviation has been corrected. What remains is order. By year's end, the idea of self-rule is no longer just dead, it's unspoken. Not by force, but by fatigue. The energy that once filled taverns and pamphlets is gone. The men who argued about taxes and treaties now manage inventories or ask for permits. No one celebrates, but no one organizes either. In homes, the silence is practical. In churches, prayers shift back to the familiar. The king is mentioned again, not as a tyrant, but as a provider of peace. Flags are replaced. Seals are restamped. Titles are reassigned. Across 13 former colonies, the only consistency is absence. What was once called a republic has vanished without a trace, and in its place stands something older, quieter, and infinitely more practiced. The empire has returned not as a conqueror, but as a bureaucrat, And bureaucracy, unlike revolution, doesn't need to inspire. It only needs to endure. 1782. The uniforms arrive before the smoke clears. British troops move not as liberators or conquerors, but as architects of normalcy. They don't burn. They don't cheer. They establish checkpoints, post notices, and build fences. In cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the arrival is methodical. Ships unload in silence. Regiments march with precision. Officers carry scrolls, not just sabers. The buildings still stand, but the atmosphere shifts. The streets grow quieter. Local officials step down, some by choice, others by order. Those who remain are given new titles and told what they may and may not do. Civil courts are suspended. Petitions are no longer accepted. Complaints are routed through military channels. Town meetings stop happening. The language of occupation isn't shouted. It's printed and posted in full, with official seals and polite phrasing. In Boston, patrols begin at dawn and continue until curfew. Shops stay open, but only those registered and approved. Pubs are allowed to serve, but not host. Newspapers are permitted if their content is reviewed by military censors. In New York, barricades appear along key intersections. Docks operate under direct supervision. Incoming goods are inspected, outgoing ones taxed. British officers move into former rebel headquarters. Church bells are silenced. Local militias are disarmed, and their weapons catalogued and stored. In Philadelphia, the process is quicker. Quakers comply without resistance. Streets are renamed. Maps are updated. Private property is respected publicly, but privately evaluated. Records are collected. Censuses are revised. The empire isn't interested in punishment. It's interested in inventory. The cities are no longer fronts. They are assets. And assets must be managed efficiently. What was once a revolution is now a jurisdictional matter. British law replaces colonial charters. Town charters are reissued or voided. New permits are required for construction, trade, even marriage in some provinces. Symbols of rebellion, flags, pamphlets, slogans, are removed or overwritten. In schools, textbooks are recalled. British history is taught, including a revised account of recent events. Not a war, but a disturbance. Not heroes, but agitators. Not freedom, but misguided discontent. Children learn new dates, new kings, new maps. Parents do not argue. Most are tired. Many are relieved. Few still believe. The atmosphere is not one of terror, but of constraint. The world narrows. Possibility shrinks. What was once a future built by ideals now becomes a present ruled by policy. Every hour is scheduled. Every action is documented. Every silence is monitored. By year's end, the transition is nearly complete. Civilian life continues, but not unchanged. Music plays, but quietly. Markets open, but under watch. Marriages are performed, but licenses are reviewed. The cities look the same, but they feel different. Fewer questions are asked. More doors are closed. The empire has done what it does best, not conquer by flame, but contain by process. There is no martial law declared publicly, but it is felt privately. There are no walls, but there are limits. There is no fear in the streets, but there is caution. The rebellion has ended, not with a collapse, but with a slow, quiet absorption. The cities remain standing. The people remain housed. The world still turns, but it turns on a different axis now, and that axis points not to freedom, but to order. 1785. Silence doesn't fall all at once. It arrives in layers, thick as fog, settling into schools, papers, books, and songs. The rebellion has been dead for 5 years, but the memory of it lingers in stories, in folk melodies hummed under breath, in names passed down with a stubborn glint. That memory, the Crown decides, is a threat. Not a sword or a musket, but something slower, more dangerous. The idea that something else was possible. So they begin with ink. Local printers are summoned. The laws are explained politely. All printed material must now be reviewed by the Office of Colonial Communications. Religious pamphlets, news bulletins, farming calendars. Nothing may be distributed without approval. Papers that once printed opinion now print weather and imports. Editorials vanish. Letters to the editor go unanswered. Print shops are shuttered if they resist. Some owners disappear. No one asks where they went. Education follows. The scattered patchwork of colonial schools, each with its own books, its own version of history, is brought under imperial control. A royal board of instruction is established in Boston, then extended to New York and Philadelphia. New textbooks are written in London. They arrive in wooden crates stamped with crests and customs clearances. Lessons begin to shift. Children are taught the glories of empire, the benevolence of the monarch, the folly of unrest. Maps are redrawn. The Atlantic is no longer a barrier between worlds, but a silver ribbon connecting loyal subjects. George Washington is mentioned once, as a misguided figure, perhaps brave but ultimately wrong. No images, no statues. The revolution itself is described as a domestic interruption, resolved with dignity and reconciliation. Teachers who refuse the new material are reassigned. Some retire. A few emigrate. The rest comply. Language changes too. Terms like colony and independence are quietly removed from public discourse. Official documents refer to the territories as provinces. The word American is discouraged, replaced by British subject in North America. Old songs are banned, though enforcement varies. A melody about liberty gets you a warning in Boston, an arrest in Charleston. Folk traditions are not outlawed outright, but monitored. Local dialects are corrected. Speech becomes a form of discipline. Children are taught to pronounce parliament with reverence, rebellion with regret. Plays and poetry must be submitted for review. Libraries are instructed to remove certain titles. A list circulates, growing longer each month. Printers adapt by leaving blank pages where controversial works once appeared. The absence speaks volumes, but only to those old enough to remember. In private, people still whisper. A phrase here, a story there. But even memory begins to warp. Children no longer ask what came before. They grow up in a world where difference is dangerous, where unity means conformity, and where forgetting is the safest way forward. By winter, the transformation feels almost complete. The press obeys, the schools conform, the people nod. There are no public burnings, no mass arrests, only edits, only omissions. What was once a continent of ideas has become a catalog of facts, selected and approved. Rebellion is not denied, it is erased. And the silence that follows is not peaceful, it is precise. 1790. What was once 13 distinct colonies is no longer treated as such. The lines on maps still exist, the names still spoken, but the machinery beneath has changed. No more local charters, no more state assemblies, no more city councils with real power. In their place is a new structure, drawn up in London and imposed with measured force: British North America. One name, one system. From the frozen edges of Quebec to the humid coast of Georgia, governance is standardized, centralized, and enforced. Local administrators are replaced by Crown-appointed overseers. Town records are rewritten in a new format. Taxation, infrastructure, policing, all fall under the same imperial departments. What used to be decisions made at the town hall are now delays from offices across the ocean. There is no room for improvisation. What works in Halifax must work in Savannah. Uniformity becomes the goal, efficiency the excuse. In daily life, the change is subtle at first. Street signs are replaced. Courthouse seals are updated. A farmer in Delaware receives orders from the same official who manages fisheries in Nova Scotia. Judicial robes are imported from London. Currency is redesigned to bear not regional icons but royal insignia. Even the calendars are aligned. Local holidays are removed, replaced with imperial observances. King's Day is celebrated with marching bands in cities that once burned effigies of the crown. Resistance is minimal, not because people accept the change, but because the idea of resistance has lost its shape. Those who once led protests are gone, or quiet, or broken. A few voices remain in the shadows, but even they are unsure who listens. Commerce is the first to adapt. Merchants shift from local cooperatives to imperial contracts. Goods are moved along routes now determined by London, not need. Southern cotton is taxed differently than northern timber, but both pass through the same bureaucratic channels. Import permits, transport licenses, export quotas, all standardized. Some benefit, most adjust. Those who protest find their warehouses closed or their accounts frozen. Trade becomes predictable but narrow. There is profit in order, but little room for ambition. The dream of building something of your own, a business, a town, a future, dims. Ambition remains, but it wears a different face. Success now means compliance. By autumn, the identity of the region is no longer colonial or revolutionary, but administrative. Children learn the names of governors general, not founding fathers. Maps in classrooms show a single color from north to south. British North America is not just a name, it's a framework, a system, a fact. The accents remain, the weather differs, but the rules are the same. Local pride shifts from independence to efficiency, from principle to order. Some still speak of liberty, but the word itself begins to feel out of place, quaint, old-fashioned, like a broken tool no one knows how to use. The land is quiet, the people are orderly, and the structure holds. For now. 1795. The land to the west is no longer a frontier. It is a file in an office, a seal on a paper, a path that begins not with a wagon, but with a license. The Crown has claimed ownership of all territory beyond the Appalachian line, not just in theory, but in practice. To settle there now is to apply. To move is to request permission. The wilderness is no longer wild. It is regulated, parceled, and mapped in London long before any settler sets foot on it. Agents of the Crown travel with surveyors, marking trees, dividing plots, writing coordinates in ledgers that will never be seen by the men and women who will one day dig their first furrows there. The language changes. It is no longer go west, but petition for land, no longer discovery, but allocation. The land remains silent, but its ownership is loudly affirmed by documents, not dreams. The process is deliberate. Applicants must demonstrate loyalty to the crown. They must prove productivity, financial stability, and moral character. Entire families are turned away not for lack of will, but for lack of paperwork. Others are resettled without choice, moved like chess pieces for strategic gain. Those who receive land find it bound with expectations, mandatory crops, infrastructure plans, even building materials. Homesteads become extensions of policy. There is no room for chance, no patience for improvisation. The West is no longer a canvas. It is a blueprint. Expansion becomes a form of control. It is not about freedom. It is about shape, design, and distance. The further one travels, the closer one feels the hand of administration. The indigenous nations watch this unfold with quiet calculation. Some resist, others negotiate, but none are treated as sovereign. Their territories are not mapped as nations, but designated as buffers, zones of distance between settlers and further ambitions. The Crown prefers this ambiguity. It allows the appearance of peace while preparing for inevitable absorption. Treaties are written in one language and broken in another. A native path becomes a border. A sacred river becomes a checkpoint. British officials speak of balance, but their maps are always expanding. Forts are built not to protect from native attack, but to remind the settlers who truly owns the land. The buffer is not for safety, it is for delay. It buys time while the gears of imperial policy turn. In towns along the Appalachian line, frustration builds. Not revolution, not yet, but resentment. Stories are whispered in taverns, of old families denied the right to grow, of sons forced east when their fathers once dreamed west. A man who might have crossed the mountains is now a clerk in a textile warehouse. A woman born to build a farm finds herself stitching uniforms for soldiers she'll never meet. The myth of the frontier fades, not because the land is gone, but because the story has been rewritten. The West is still there, green, vast, and waiting, but it no longer belongs to those who dream. It belongs to the ones who stamp the papers, and the land waits, quietly, but not forever. 1800, and the cotton is king. Not just in the fields, not just in the markets, but in the offices of crown investors, in the ledgers of British banks, and in the portfolios of ministers who will never set foot on American soil. The South, with its wide plantations and long growing seasons, has become the engine of the empire's textile trade. And at the center of it all is labor, stolen, beaten, bought, and sold. There is no moral debate, no abolitionist pamphlets passed hand to hand in northern cities, no religious cries for emancipation echoing from pulpits. The northern resistance, that slow-building moral tide that once threatened to divide a nation, simply never begins. The colonies, now provinces, are united under order and silence. Slavery is not merely tolerated, it is incentivized. Planters in Carolina and Georgia speak in pounds sterling, not ideals. British subsidies arrive in quiet intervals, loans for machinery, grants for expansion, tax relief for exports. In return, the empire receives bales of cotton, crates of tobacco, barrels of sugar. But it also receives loyalty. The southern elite grow rich, their mansions larger, their influence deeper. They fund militias to patrol their borders, build schools for their sons only, and dine with crown officials when they visit. Their power is not local, not anymore. It stretches across the Atlantic. And those who work the fields, the men, women, and children shackled in the dust, are written into this system not as people, but as units, columns on a spreadsheet, assets of the realm. The plantations swell, and so do the auctions. There are no safe harbors. There is no underground railroad, no coded quilts, no northern churches with basements hiding fugitives. Escape means exile, to the swamps, the mountains, or beyond the colonial borders entirely. Some run south to Spanish Florida. Some vanish into the forests. Most do not run at all. The punishment is too swift, too certain, too final. And without a north to pull toward, without even the idea of freedom flickering on the horizon, resistance becomes internal. Quiet. A prayer hummed at dusk. A name whispered through generations. A glance between hands as they pass the cotton. There is memory. But memory alone cannot break chains. In London, slavery is a topic of commerce, not conscience. There are voices who speak against it. Faint, academic, easily ignored. The Crown knows the value of the system. It fuels industry. It funds expansion. And most importantly, it ensures compliance. A colony of chained laborers is a colony that will not rebel. The American South, in this timeline, is not a powder keg waiting to explode. It is a pressure chamber designed to hold. And it does. For now. The cotton is picked. The ships are loaded. The money moves. And the silence grows heavy, like the air before a storm. 1807, and the towns are full. More people, more families, more factories. The streets of Boston echo with cartwheels and footsteps. The markets of Philadelphia bustle from dawn until dusk, and New York's harbor swells with ships. Children run between tenements. Merchants call prices above the din, and wagons crawl along muddy roads so crowded they rarely move. The colonies, now decades into their transformation into British North America, are no longer sparse, scattered outposts. They are crowded, growing, hungry. But none of that growth translates into voice. There are no elections, no representatives, no assemblies to speak for the people. Only appointed governors, imported from London or drawn from loyal families. The decisions are made far away, by men with powdered wigs and polished pens who have never walked these streets and never will. The people know this, of course. They know their voices carry no weight, that petitions are quietly ignored, and that any effort to organize is met with silence, or worse. A gathering of more than 10 is watched. A gathering of 20 is broken up. A gathering of 50 earns prison terms. Newspapers print what they're allowed. Preachers speak of faith, not of justice. And when someone asks why, there is only one answer. The Crown knows best. Dissent doesn't vanish, but it is pushed down, buried under routine and resignation. A shopkeeper in Baltimore might grumble over his ledger. A dock worker in Charleston might curse the tax on salt. But there is nowhere to send those words. They rise into the air, dissipate, and vanish. And the taxes, they grow. Quietly, steadily, with a bureaucrat's efficiency. A shilling more for tea, 2 more for imported tools, a levy on timber, on ink, on glass. Even the price of salt creeps higher. The roads are not repaired faster. The schools do not improve. The soldiers, however, are well fed. The governors live in brick mansions, guarded and silent. London insists that the taxes are necessary to protect the realm, to maintain order, to repay debts from wars fought an ocean away. But few believe these explanations. Most understand. The taxes are a leash, a reminder, a way to turn prosperity into obedience. As towns prosper, so too must they submit. Families grow, but expectations shrink. A farmer's son might move to the city, not to change the world, but to find work and avoid trouble. A school teacher might teach letters and numbers, but not history, not politics. A mother might whisper stories of a freer time, but only at night, and only to children too young to understand the danger of repeating them. Generation by generation, the people adapt. They find ways to live within the rules. But the frustration simmers, not as fire, not yet, as heat beneath the surface, slow and gathering, because even those who obey feel the weight. Even those who benefit see the imbalance. And though the words representation, equality, and freedom have been erased from the public square, they still live, in memory, in whispers, in dreams too dangerous to speak aloud. 1814, and the tension finally cracks. It starts small, as most things do. A rumor in western Pennsylvania, passed from hand to hand, about a grain tax being doubled. A preacher in Virginia, speaking too loudly about the price of justice. A gathering at a mill, then another at a tavern, then a third in a dusty barn behind a church, where too many voices speak at once and no one bothers to whisper. They are tired of the burden, tired of the silence, tired of watching the fruits of their work sail eastward while their towns rot from neglect. No one calls it rebellion. Not yet. But there are signs. The refusal to pay a toll. The tearing down of a proclamation nailed to the courthouse door. A constable beaten, not killed, but sent limping back with his uniform in rags. These are sparks, nothing more. But in a dry forest, a spark is enough. The governors act quickly. They do not wait for approval from London. Orders are drafted overnight. In Pennsylvania, regiments march west along the Allegheny, and in Virginia, red-coated patrols spread through the hills like a red net. In towns where murmurs once passed in the open, soldiers now walk 2 by 2, eyes hard, rifles clean. Doors are knocked on at dawn. Meetings, even prayer meetings, are outlawed if not registered in advance. Public spaces are watched, then closed. A young man who speaks at a funeral is dragged away in front of the mourners. A printing press in Harrisburg is smashed with hammers and left in the street like a warning. When farmers protest, their crops are trampled. When wives ask questions, their husbands are taken. It is not a war. There are no battlefields. Only swift consequences and a long silence after. In private, some of the governors express regret. They write to each other in cautious letters. This will pass, they say. It always does. These are isolated cases, but they know it is not true. The people are changing. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly. A mood settling over the land like fog. They no longer believe what they are told. They no longer wait for things to improve. The idea of loyalty, once tied to family, to faith, to tradition, has become transactional. and the cost keeps rising. The government, in turn, becomes more brittle, more defensive. A single complaint is treated as sedition. A misplaced pamphlet leads to house searches. Juries are abolished for political trials. The law, once slow and ceremonial, becomes fast and cold. Justice is no longer blind. It simply looks the other way. In the years that follow, the memory of 1814 becomes a kind of cautionary tale. Children are told not to ask too much. Teachers avoid the subject entirely. Those who were arrested do not return, or if they do not speak of where they've been. Towns that once held dances now hold their breath. No monuments are built. No names are carved in stone. But the story survives, not in books, but in glances, in pauses, in the careful way someone locks their door before saying anything honest. What was lost in that year was not a battle or a city, but a permission. The silent permission to dream of more. That permission, once taken away, is hard to ask for again. And yet, beneath the quiet, the land remembers. It remembers the voices raised, the flags burned, the footsteps in the night. It remembers not the cause, but the courage. And memory, even without hope, is hard to erase. 1820, and the silence has begun to settle into the bones of the land. Those who once remembered freedom are older now, quieter. Their stories, if told at all, come with disclaimers. That's just what your grandfather said, or don't repeat this at school. The younger generation, now reaching adulthood, has no memory of protests or assemblies or the sound of voices rising together. They know only what they've been taught. Loyalty, obedience, duty. To question is not forbidden, exactly. It is simply unthinkable. The names of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, if they appear, they do so in the margins of discredited pamphlets, spoken of with a half smile or a wary glance. In the official textbooks, they're labeled dissenters, disruptors. Men who mistook ambition for vision. Their dreams are now considered mistakes, their hopes miscalculations. The rebellion, if it's mentioned at all, is a cautionary tale. A flicker that burned out quickly and wisely. The cities are stable. Streets are clean. Schools operate on schedule, with inspectors visiting weekly to ensure lesson plans adhere to the curriculum approved in Ottawa and passed through London. The children recite oaths each morning, not from fear, but from habit. They know their flags, their monarchs, their duties. What they do not know is what it means to speak without permission. They've never seen a rally, never heard a chant rise from a crowd. They've never been allowed to disagree without consequence. For many, it does not feel like oppression. It feels like normal. This is the only air they've breathed, the only sky they've known. And so when a teacher hesitates before assigning a novel, when a father lowers his voice at the dinner table, the children do not understand why. They only sense the weight in the room and learn to carry it too. In the countryside, the unease lingers in older faces. Farmers who remember the grain riots look over their shoulders when they sell at market. Preachers offer sermons on duty, on gratitude, on the danger of pride, carefully avoiding parables that once inspired courage. Local papers print only what's safe, what's expected. But beneath the surface, a subtle resistance takes root. Not in speeches or in slogans, those are too dangerous now, but in silence. In the refusal to sing at a public event, in a shopkeeper keeping a book behind the counter that's not supposed to exist, in small gatherings on back porches where stories are passed down not as history, but as inheritance. These stories no longer sound like truth. They sound like myth. And yet, they persist. Because even when freedom becomes invisible, the shape it once carved in the mind does not vanish. This is the first generation raised in full darkness, and yet, that darkness is not total. Curiosity, by nature, survives suppression. A teenager in New Haven finds a torn page behind the lining of a drawer and reads about a meeting held in secret in 1776. He tells no one, but he remembers. A girl in Charleston hears a hymn her grandmother hums, one not in any hymnal, and hums it herself when alone. They don't know what these things mean. Not yet. But something stirs. Something that has no shape, no plan, no language, only a question. Was there ever more than this? That question, once born, is hard to kill. It does not ignite a movement, not yet. But it waits, patient and quiet, like a seed in cold earth, and in time, maybe, it will grow. 1828. And the land hums with movement, not rebellion. Trains whistle through the forests of New Jersey, their black smoke curling like questions into the gray sky. Canals carve their way across old fields once stained by musket smoke, now repurposed into trade routes bearing coal, grain, cotton, and silence. Roads stretch like veins from port to plantation, from factory to frontier. They connect cities not to each other, but to a single point across the ocean. London is the heart. Everything else beats because it says so. From Halifax to Savannah, the British Empire is building something solid, ordered, unbreakable. Stone bridges, iron rails, measured miles, surveyed plots. Even the rivers seem trained to flow more efficiently now, with locks and levees adjusting their rhythm to fit the crown's design. The continent has never been so active, and never felt less its own. Factories rise in Philadelphia, now cleaner, quieter under British law. Children walk in lines to workhouses at dawn, wearing identical wool uniforms stamped with the seal of the Royal Colonial Office. Their wages are stable, their hours are long, their futures are already spoken for. Steam presses clatter in Boston, printing ledgers, not pamphlets. No poetry, no protest, only the ledgers, the contracts, the manuals. The ledgers tell of growth, productivity, efficiency. They don't mention the men who once argued in taverns. They don't note the churches that were torn down for rail yards. They do not record how many names have vanished from memory. These ledgers are accurate and incomplete. They speak a truth, but not the whole one. And for now, they're enough, because the economy grows, the trains run, and nobody starves. Not really. Not visibly. At the ports, ships come and go with mechanical precision. British goods in, colonial goods out. Tariffs calculated not by local needs, but by imperial quotas. There is wealth here, yes. Gold changes hands. Merchants profit. Even some landowners thrive. But the power to decide what to grow, what to build, what to dream, that lives elsewhere. Decisions arrive in packets, in red-sealed envelopes delivered by men on horseback. Even the governors nod before opening them. They call it stability. They call it unity. And maybe it is. But every beam laid, every shipment logged, every child trained to measure worth in pounds and shillings, All of it builds a structure that holds tight and never bends. London wants a colony that produces, not one that remembers. And so the past is paved over, not with cruelty, but with purpose. There are voices, of course, voices that remember something else. A woman in Baltimore who still tells her grandchildren about a flag with stars. A preacher in Albany who quotes from a forbidden document without naming it. A sailor in Charleston who sings a song that doesn't match the hymn sheet. These voices are quiet, not silenced exactly, but softened by time and distance. They don't cry out, they echo. And the echo is fading. Because the trains don't stop for stories. The roads don't pause for memory. The machines keep moving, day and night, mile after mile. And as they move, they flatten. They connect and erase. There is no space left for rebellion. Not now. Not when the ledgers balance and the factories shine and the children line up on time. In 1828, everything is working, and that perhaps is the most dangerous part. 1836, and a name begins to surface, not loudly, not in the halls of government or the headlines of London-approved newspapers. No, it emerges in whispers, in the margins, in places where light doesn't reach as easily, behind bakery counters, in the break rooms of textile mills, on the tongues of school children who don't know they're repeating contraband. Columbia. At first, it means nothing, a slip of a word, a shadow with no shape. But it catches. It returns. It hums beneath the surface of the well-oiled imperial machine. You hear it in a lullaby, misremembered by a mother who once heard her grandfather hum it. You see it scratched into the bottom corner of a dock worker's tool chest. You feel it in the hush that falls over the room when someone says it out loud, as if it's a memory from someone else's dream, and yet somehow still yours. No one teaches it, yet it spreads. The word finds its way into folk songs, altered enough to pass inspection. One speaks of a river where eagles used to fly. Another hums about the land that never bowed. None mention rebellion. None mention kings. But the tone is wrong, too mournful, too proud. Authorities dismiss them as local flavor, quaint backwoods ballads with no political substance. And they're not wrong. There are no calls to arms, no manifestos, just stories. Stories of a place that might have been, or might still be, if only enough people could remember it clearly. A place not ruled by London, not governed by appointed men in red sashes, but built by common hands, held together by choice, not force. The geography is vague, the timeline inconsistent, but the name remains the same. Columbia, not a colony, not an empire. A possibility. The leaflets are harder to ignore. They appear in the alleys behind public houses, tucked into coat pockets, folded inside crates of imported wheat. Cheap paper, poor ink, no author. Just fragments, a phrase here, a question there. Who gave them the right? What if we remembered? Columbia was never lost, only taken. They aren't radical, not yet. They don't suggest action, only thought. They call to something older than policy, deeper than law. And perhaps that's why they're so troubling. Because for the first time in decades, people begin to wonder, not about power, but about identity. Not about rebellion, but about belonging. Not what they should do, but who they might have been. and who, quietly, they still could be. By winter, the name has reached the factories, not in official conversations, of course, but in glances, in symbols drawn on chalkboards and erased just as quickly, in candles left burning a moment longer than needed. A ritual with no explanation. Overseers don't understand it. Clergy preach against it. Governors report it. But none of them can pin it down. Because Colombia isn't an agenda. It isn't a slogan. It's a ghost. A placeholder for something absent but felt. And the harder they try to crush it, the more solid it seems to become. In 1836, the word has no army, no anthem, no territory. But it has something harder to uproot, a myth. And from that myth, a new kind of memory begins to grow. One that was never real, but feels more true than anything they've been told. 1842, and silence becomes policy. Not just the absence of noise, but the deliberate erasure of anything that doesn't conform. London no longer dismisses the murmurs of Colombia as harmless nostalgia. It now sees them as infection, and infections must be contained. So the watch lists grow. So do the unmarked wagons, arriving at night and leaving at dawn. In towns where the name was once whispered with a kind of reverent mischief, it now vanishes altogether. Not because belief fades, but because fear takes its place. You see it in the shopkeepers who scrape etched stars off their counters, in school teachers who burn stacks of homemade lesson plans, one page at a time, in children who suddenly forget the songs they used to hum. They are not taught to forget. They are taught to fear remembering, and they learn quickly. The symbols go first. Flags not officially recognized are banned. Colors associated with dissident folklore are quietly retired. A red scarf, a white pine tree, even a certain shape of lantern becomes suspect. Blacklists circulate, unannounced and unreadable. A preacher is removed for quoting an unaudited gospel. A carpenter disappears after carving an eagle into the side of a cradle. A grocer is questioned for stocking flour from a known sympathizer's mill. No charges, no trials, just sudden absences, and a public that quickly learns which questions are safest left unasked. The disappearance of symbolism isn't just censorship, it's architecture. Every erased object leaves a hole, and the new symbols, the ones blessed by the crown, fill those holes like mortar. Official portraits, heraldic badges, a new school primer titled The Light of the Isles. These replacements don't just instruct, they overwrite. Surveillance becomes a kind of ritual. Notices appear, reminding citizens of their duty to report anomalies in speech or conduct. Entire neighborhoods form volunteer compliance guilds. Their purpose is vague. Their authority, absolute. They knock on doors without reason. They attend public readings. They catalog street art, collect discarded pamphlets, and photograph school chalkboards. The reports they send back to London are inconsistent, but the result is always the same. More removals, more restrictions, more quiet. The law doesn't change often, because it doesn't need to. It isn't what's written down that matters. It's what people believe will happen. And by now, no one doubts what silence can cost. An erased family, a renamed street, a child gone before breakfast and never mentioned again. Fear isn't the law, it's the enforcement. But even under all this, the myth does not die. It simply retreats deeper, becomes more careful, more encoded. In one city, a tailor continues to sew hidden markings into coat linings. a stitch pattern that tells of forests and liberty. In another, a group of students meets once a month under the pretense of Latin tutoring, but they read only poetry. Poetry about rivers, about mourning, about things that never existed. They're careful, more careful than their older brothers, and more patient. They know the story will outlive them. It always has. So they let the fire cool just enough to stop the smoke. Not extinguished, just buried. Waiting. Because by now everyone understands. Colombia is not a flag, not a border, not even a name. It's the thing that still exists after everything else is taken away. And that Britain cannot seem to destroy. 1849, and the frontier is no longer wild, just mapped. Not by those who walk it, but by those who sign the orders in rooms they'll never leave. Ottawa becomes the nerve center of westward expansion. Not Boston, not New York, and certainly not the towns on the edge of the tree line. Here, decisions come folded in envelopes, printed in ink that has never touched dirt, yet dictates how much of it can be claimed, mined, fenced, or sold. The land moves west, acre by acre, but the hands that guide it remain far away. Orders are precise, language cold, and as the territories open up, it becomes clear they are not opening to all, only to those bearing the crown's license. Others, those whose ancestors have called the forests and plains home, are labeled obstructions. And obstructions are meant to be cleared. The displacements are never described as such. On paper, they are adjustments, protective relocations, strategic resettlements. The language is almost gentle, as if movement were a gift. But in truth, it's an extraction. Villages vanish overnight. Fires are doused not with water, but with silence. Children wake to find their homes marked in chalk, their elders speaking less with each sunrise. Some are marched away, guarded by men who do not meet their eyes. Others are simply warned, this is no longer your land. The old trails become patrol routes. Sacred grounds become survey points. The buffalo routes are disrupted. River crossings are taxed. Hunting seasons are restricted until the herds are gone. It's not one event. It's erosion. And when people look back, they don't remember a war. They remember an absence, a thinning of the world that was. Yet the land itself remembers. Each hollowed-out grove and flooded meadow bears the weight of names no longer spoken. In the West, stories pass in whispers, of medicine circles torn down for rail tracks, of elders buried without song. The crown plants flags where totems once stood. They build posts and forts, not to defend, but to observe. Their maps redraw rivers, rename mountains, and erase lakes that were never empty. Some settlers hesitate, confused by the silence, but most arrive with grants in hand and gratitude on their lips, eager for the promised space. They call it opportunity. They do not ask who paid for it. And over time, that becomes normal. The forgetting, the comfort, the idea that this land was always waiting. But not everyone forgets. In isolated pockets, the stories survive, carried by grandmothers who bury feathers beneath floorboards, by drummers who only play after sundown, by children who draw animals they've never seen but somehow remember. Resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it is just continued breath. A song hummed under a breath. A word repeated in a language banned from classrooms. Even as treaties are broken before the ink dries, even as nations are reduced to names on rejected petitions. The truth does not die. It remains, like a fault line beneath a polished floor, quiet, unseen, but always waiting to shift, because land remembers, and so do the people. 1856, and the quiet breaks. Not with speeches or pamphlets, but with rifles drawn from beneath floorboards and maps sketched in ash on barn walls. It begins in the interior, far from the ports, where the reach of the crown feels thinner, or so they thought. There, among mill towns and railroad junctions, workers and former militia whisper the same name: Columbia. They say it like a hymn, a country that never was but should have been. Farmers speak of taxes they never voted on. Dock workers remember their fathers beaten for striking. And miners, Irish, Welsh, German, pass along rumors that someone somewhere is ready to fight. What forms is not an army, but a convergence. Not a revolution, but a crack in the facade. They come with tools turned weapons, flags sewn in basements, names etched into cartridge belts. There is no single leader, no grand speech, just a shared silence before the first shots are fired. The uprising spreads fast, not because it's strong, but because the anger has long been ready. Whole counties lose telegraph lines overnight. Road signs are torn down. Local officials vanish or flee. For a brief moment, it feels possible. Not victory, but defiance. The idea that they might finally be more than subjects, that their voices, if raised together, might be louder than the empire's weight. But hope is not a strategy, and improvisation is not logistics. The British do not underestimate. They respond with precision. Troops move in, not just redcoats from across the sea, but colonial regiments, Irish brigades from Halifax, Canadian units from Montreal. They speak the same languages as the rebels. Some even share cousins. But loyalty is clear. The crown pays, the crown feeds, and the crown commands. The rebellion is surrounded before it fully coheres. There are no heroic last stands, no cities held, no manifestos read aloud to crowds. Instead, there are field arrests, burned barns, and midnight raids. Anyone caught with a weapon is declared treasonous. Those who sheltered rebels are exiled or imprisoned without trial. In the weeks that follow, courts operate without juries. Executions are rare but public. The message is sharp, unmistakable. Dissent is not a debate. It is an enemy act. And enemies do not receive compromise. In London, newspapers speak of order restored. In Ottawa, officials praise the loyalty of the Dominion's sons. There are medals given, speeches made. But beneath it all, something new festers. Not resistance, not yet, but resentment. A quiet grief for what might have begun, had it lasted even a day longer. And then comes the forgetting. Not for everyone, but in the ways that matter. School books make no mention. Records are sealed. Those who remember are told to move on, to be grateful for the peace that returned. But scars do not vanish on command, and for some the memory grows sharper with the years. They remember the sound of boots in the mud, the smell of torch smoke on wool. They remember a neighbor who never returned, a cousin shot without trial, a melody hummed under breath that now feels like sedition. And most of all, they remember that for a few brief days, they were more than ruled. They were together. And that too becomes dangerous. The knowledge that unity once existed, even if it failed. Because failures are not always endings. Sometimes they are seeds. 1863, and the empire turns its gaze outward. Beyond the Atlantic, tensions rise in India, the Pacific, and Africa. Rebellion stirs elsewhere, and trade routes must be secured. London drafts new plans, redirects officers, and shifts battalions to hotter fronts. Across British North America, uniforms thin out. The garrisons in Philadelphia, Richmond, and Albany no longer march daily in the squares. Forts, once humming with drills, now echo hollow. There is no announcement, no formal change of rule, but the air shifts. Patrols are fewer, inspections slower, papers less scrutinized, and in that space something long buried begins to breathe again. Not open defiance, not yet, but whispers, passed in back rooms and forest clearings, names remembered, songs reworded. Children told stories that had nearly been erased, and behind each smile in the street, a question silently asked, are they watching as closely as they were? It doesn't begin with guns. It begins with pages, illegally printed pamphlets, stashed inside crates of grain, sermons that end with verses not found in scripture, workers' meetings held in barns under the pretense of auctions. The word Columbia returns, this time as a question, not a slogan. What if? What if the dream never died? What if it still lives behind the eyes of millers and masons, of widows and wheelwrights? The organizers are careful. They know the empire forgets nothing, but they also know its reach is weaker now. Loyalist informants are still there, but even they grow tired. Their pay is late, their authority resented. And in the hills of Pennsylvania, the swamps of the Carolinas, and the factories of upstate New York, small groups form, without uniforms, without flags. They call themselves readers, watchers, gardeners. Their tools are leaflets, secret roots, coded hymns. But the seed they plant is old. The belief that rule without voice is not peace, but pause. The British respond, but not with full force. They cannot. Too many fronts, too few hands. Some commanders dismiss the signs as scattered mischief. Others ask for reinforcements and are told to manage locally. The result is inconsistent. One town is raided for harboring agitators, another ignored entirely. A preacher disappears in Vermont. A printer is publicly flogged in Maryland. But elsewhere, rebels walk free in daylight. The inconsistency breeds confidence and confusion. For every small act of defiance, there's a neighbor who stays silent, a constable who looks away, a merchant who quietly donates ink or cloth or food. The line between loyalist and sympathizer begins to blur, and in that blur, a new kind of movement takes root. Less about battle, more about memory. Less about winning, more about refusing to forget. It is slow, it is scattered, but it spreads. By winter, the countryside whispers louder than the cities. Night riders leave chalk marks on gates. Teachers distribute false lesson plans with real messages tucked inside. A child in Delaware recites a banned poem by heart. A widow in Georgia hides fugitives beneath her chapel. The authorities, when they catch them, punish with spectacle. But each punishment echoes too far. A hanged courier becomes a martyr. A burned shack becomes a shrine. And the more they try to quiet it, the more it multiplies, not with fury, but with patience. These are not fighters. Not yet. They are seeds, messengers, memory carriers. Their names won't appear in records, their faces won't hang in halls, but they make it possible for something larger to return. Not in months, not even in years, but in time. And time now seems to be shifting in their favor. 1871, and the machines do not stop. Towns swell into cities, smokestacks choke the skies, and rail lines carve the land like scars. British North America is no longer a patchwork of ports and plantations. It is a system, humming with coal, iron, and motion. The old rhythms of colonial trade have given way to something faster, louder, and less forgiving. Textile mills clatter through the night. Foundries roar before dawn. Miners descend before the sun rises and emerge long after it sets. Wages are counted in hours survived, not in comfort earned. And in the tenements of Boston, the alleys of Baltimore, and the shadowed corners of Pittsburgh, something new begins to form. Not out of ideology, but out of necessity. Men and women gather not as rebels, but as survivors. Not with weapons, but with ledgers, rosters, and pledges whispered by candlelight. These gatherings are small, and they have no names at first. A shared loaf, a pooled fund for the widow of a crushed dock worker, a night school for children who sleep through daylight to work at night. The empire sees no threat. What threat is a mother's kitchen? What danger is a list of wages scrawled on scrap paper? But as more hands reach for the same tools and more voices echo the same demands, these acts of survival begin to stitch into something more, something deliberate. They call them councils, not parliaments, not assemblies, just councils, of iron, of flour, of river workers. They speak in accents shaped by soot and salt. Their minutes are kept in smudged notebooks. Their meetings are held in silence until the door is latched 3 times. They do not speak of Columbia, not yet. But they speak of fairness, of hours, of dignity. The Crown's administrators struggle to keep pace. London knows the numbers. Grain exports doubled, coal output tripled, factory zones expanded. But numbers don't translate into control. The overseers sent from Ottawa or directly from Britain arrive too late, act too slowly, or simply don't understand the language of soot-covered laborers who have never seen a redcoat in their lifetime. Laws lag behind locomotives. Edicts get lost between provinces. By the time a regulation is printed, the need it was meant to answer has multiplied. In the silence of that lag, the councils grow bolder. They post demands outside mill gates. They mediate disputes the magistrates ignore. They refuse to let families starve just because a supervisor decided to withhold pay. They do what the government no longer can, or no longer cares to do. And the people begin to notice. Recognition does not come officially. The empire does not negotiate with unrecognized bodies, but recognition comes anyway. A mill owner quietly concedes a half-day break each week to avoid a strike. A harbor official asks the Grain Council to help allocate shipments when the port falls behind schedule. A local doctor waives fees for workers marked as council members, hoping they'll send him more patients. It is a quiet shift, unspoken, unofficial, undeniable. The councils are no longer just helpers. They are brokers of stability, not rebels, not yet, but something adjacent. And for the first time in decades, there is an echo of agency, a whisper of what it felt like, generations ago, to act not by permission, but by principle. Still, They are fragile. One accusation, one raid, one informant could unravel weeks of organizing. But they endure, not because of ideology, but because nothing else works. The state governs from a distance, the councils from next door. And in the gap between what is ruled and what is real, people begin to choose. Not out of loyalty, not even out of hope, but out of weariness. Out of the simple truth that when the machine breaks, it is the council, not the crown, that sends someone to fix it. 1880, and the words begin to spread. Not shouted in the streets, not printed in bold on front pages, but whispered behind factory walls and passed hand to hand beneath the tables of schoolrooms. The first copies of the illegal manifesto, known only as Free Colombia, are little more than ink on brittle paper, misaligned, smudged, printed at night in basements where the air stinks of oil and secrecy. No author is named. No organization is credited. But its words move like smoke. Workers fold it into their lunch pails. Porters tuck it into crates bound for the interior. School teachers hide it inside geography books and read it aloud after lessons are done. The document does not call for violence. It doesn't even speak of revolution. But it does something far more dangerous. It imagines. It imagines a place not ruled by London. It imagines Colombia. At first, few take it seriously. A pamphlet, after all, is just a pamphlet, and the empire has weathered worse. The administrators in Ottawa chuckle at its idealism. Another American fever dream, they say, like liberty, like representation. But then the copies don't stop. Every week, more turn up in places they shouldn't. A fisherman finds one in a bait bucket. A seamstress finds another sewn into a lining. In the shipyards of Boston, a foreman is caught reading it to his crew. In the hills of Appalachia, entire mining camps begin holding silent readings. The authorities start to notice, but they can't trace the source. Every arrest leads to silence, every interrogation to a wall. Because there is no one leader, no central printer. The idea is the movement, and it's too small, too scattered, too woven into daily life to be cut out cleanly. The words of Free Colombia are simple, and that is why they work. They don't argue legal theory. They don't quote philosophers. They ask questions. Why do we pay taxes to a king we've never seen? Why do we fight his wars and bury our children under his banners? Why are our schools silent on our own history? It speaks of soil, of family, of streets walked daily under foreign flags. It dares to name the silence in every heart, the ache for a country that does not yet exist but should. Not in fire but in order, not with rifles but with voice, not in glory but in dignity. And those who read it find something that's been missing for generations, a name for the feeling they've never been able to say aloud. That name is Colombia. By the year's end, Free Colombia is no longer just paper. It is a song hummed in warehouses. It is a word scratched on the undersides of desks. It is a stencil sprayed onto train cars at night. The empire issues warnings. Newspapers are raided. Print shops are closed. But for every fire they light, 2 more pages are pressed in secret. The manifesto becomes the seed of memory, not of a real past, but of a future pretending to be remembered. And that is what makes it powerful, because people do not fight for what they have. They fight for what they believe they should have had all along. 1888, and a voice is finally allowed. The American Assembly is not granted power, but permitted presence. It cannot command troops, draft laws, or set taxes, but it can speak. And that alone, after over a century of silence, makes the ground shift ever so slightly. It meets in Philadelphia, under armed watch, in a hall too pristine to feel honest. The British call it symbolic. The colonists call it something else. Tentative, uncertain, but real. The air is cold inside, but the words are not. Carefully spoken, yes, but not meaningless. A voice that doesn't yet echo, but isn't ignored either. The men who rise to speak are chosen, but not elected. Approved, but not trusted. Most are former merchants or educators, men with clean records and quieter reputations. They begin with questions, not demands. How much grain will be exported next season? Can roads be built between eastern towns without petitioning London? They ask about tariffs, about labor, about weather. But none of the questions are truly about policy. They are about permission. The assembly listens to itself with a reverence it has never known. And when one speaker finishes, others do not interrupt. They wait. They wait because they know that this moment is thin, and they do not want it to tear. Outside the hall, the press prints nothing. No minutes are released. No speeches are quoted. But the word still spreads, not because of leaflets, but because of listeners, servants, guards, janitors, men and women who lean close to doors and carry news home. In factory dormitories and dockside alleys, whispers build. They spoke. They stood. They disagreed. The sentences don't need to be long, just enough to prove something changed. For the first time in generations, there are names in people's mouths that aren't governors or kings. No one expects the assembly to last, but no one can deny that it has begun. The British authorities are not afraid. Not yet. They see this as a calculated release valve, a way to ease pressure before it becomes dangerous. Let them talk, they say. Let them form their little circle and pretend to legislate. It means nothing. But quietly, some of them are less sure. Because something strange is happening. The colonists aren't protesting. They aren't shouting. They're listening. They're learning how to argue, not just how to obey. And deep down, the empire knows speech is not just sound, it's practice. And practice becomes habit. 1888 marks no revolution, but it does mark a rhythm, and for now, that is enough. 1896, and the lessons begin. Not in official halls, not with sanctioned texts, but in basements lit by oil lamps and attics warmed by shared breath. The children arrive after dark, slipping between alleys and entering through back doors. They carry no notebooks, only memory. The teachers are former dock workers, librarians, seamstresses, anyone with a voice steady enough to tell a story and hands gentle enough to turn a page without tearing it. There is no curriculum, only names and places, passed down from the ones who still remember. Lexington, Yorktown, Columbia. Words spoken like myths, half believed, but clung to nonetheless. The textbooks are not printed here. They come from across the water, from sympathetic presses hidden in fishing towns along the Nova Scotian coast. Smuggled in crates marked machine parts or textiles, the books are stitched by hand and bound in rough cloth. They contain timelines, maps with forgotten borders, portraits of rebels whose faces were once painted over or erased. Each volume is a thread in a tapestry that no one can display, but everyone can feel. Owning one is illegal. Teaching from one is treason. But the books multiply. 1 becomes 5, 5 become 20. They're copied, transcribed, hidden in crates of firewood or inside wall panels. No one makes a living from them, but they keep living just the same. Parents know, some are afraid, others encourage. Remember where your grandfather was born, they whisper. Remember what they tried to build. In homes where the British flag hangs in the parlor, children recite dates under their breath while washing dishes. In neighborhoods under curfew, they draw forbidden maps in frost on window panes. The knowledge is not perfect. Some of it is wrong, some embellished, but it's theirs. And the knowing of it, however incomplete, makes the silence around it feel thinner, less permanent, like wallpaper over brick. If you press hard enough, it crumbles. The empire notices eventually. A few arrests, a few school raids, a fire in Baltimore that consumes 6 houses and 24 books. But it is already too late. The idea is seeded now, and it is growing in the minds of children who don't remember a world without it. They will become printers and teachers and parents, and they will carry the story forward, not with guns, not with flags, but with questions. Why are some names missing? Why does no one teach the revolution? Why must we learn to forget? The answers are never satisfying, and slowly, the silence around them begins to feel like guilt. 1904, and the language starts to shift. What was once rule becomes negotiation. What was once command becomes suggestion. In quiet offices along the eastern coast, colonial administrators, born in London but raised in the colonies, begin to speak differently. They no longer issue mandates with the confidence of distance. Instead, they write proposals. They suggest compromise. They ask, not often and never publicly, but enough that the tone is noticed. They are still loyal to the crown, still bear the seal, still drink their tea at the proper hour. But beneath the formality is hesitation. Not fear, not yet, but unease, like a man standing in a room that's too quiet, listening for something that hasn't happened yet. The criticism comes first from within. Loyalist newspapers speak of regional anarchy. Pamphlets circulate accusing Philadelphia of cultural defiance, accusing Boston of fiscal irregularities, accusing Charleston of disloyal sentiment. None of these accusations are fully true, but none are entirely false. The colonies are not aligned, not united, not openly rebellious, but they are drifting, each in its own way, each with its own pace. Some maintain the forms of British tradition, but twist them into something new. Others ignore them altogether, developing local codes, local currencies, even local holidays. The British governors frown, but behind closed doors they whisper, "We cannot hold them as we did before." In Parliament, the American question returns, quietly, as it always does, not with debate, but with weary muttering in committees and corridors. They're no longer subjects, one MP confides to another, but not yet citizens either, so what are they? No one answers. The law books are outdated. The policies don't fit. The administrators are overwhelmed. There are too many roads, too many towns, too many new ideas, and too few ships to carry old orders westward. The system hasn't broken, but it is groaning under its own weight. When requests arrive from New York for updated guidelines, they're marked urgent. When they arrive from Ohio, they're simply marked unread. And still, the people move, across rivers, through mountains, into territories where London's name is spoken like a memory, not a master. There, assemblies form without permission. Councils meet without guards. Some call them provisional, some call them illegal. The Crown calls them nothing, because to acknowledge them would be to confront what everyone already knows. Authority is not where it once was. It hasn't vanished, but it has shifted, not to a capital, not to a general, but to the ground itself, to the people walking it. And the empire, for all its ships and laws, is left asking instead of telling, pleading instead of punishing. For the first time, the colonies do not bend. They nod, politely, slowly, and only when it suits them. 1914, and the world erupts. It begins far away, in a place most have never seen, with names few can pronounce. But soon, British America is no longer watching. It's marching. London calls for loyalty, and loyalty arrives in the form of young men in uniform, packed into trains, then ships, then trenches. From Halifax to Georgia, the call is answered. Not with enthusiasm, not with certainty, but with habit. They were told it was their duty. They were told they were part of something larger, and so they went. Sons of farmers and dock workers, clerks from Boston, steel workers from Pittsburgh. They went not for empire, but because it was expected, and because to refuse was unthinkable. The scale is beyond anything they imagined. The mud, the noise, the stench, all real, all immediate. And then there are the letters, folded into pockets, passed from trench to trench. They cross oceans to reach wooden porches and kitchen tables back home. They are not full of heroism. They speak of rain that never stops, of friends who vanish, of orders that make no sense, and most of all, of doubt. Doubt about the cause, about the flag they carry, about the empire that sent them. Some write openly, others more carefully. But the question hangs over every page. Why are we here? Back home, those questions multiply. Mothers hang black cloth in windows. Churches hold too many funerals. And newspapers, once eager to print tales of glory, start to soften their tone. British America honors its fallen, they say. But even those headlines carry a tremble. There is grief, yes, but also distance. These are not London's sons. These are not the king's neighbors. These are men from Ohio, from Maine, from Tennessee. And the war, though shared, does not feel shared equally. Supplies from the colonies feed the front. Troops from the colonies bleed for the front. But decisions, orders, strategy, all made elsewhere. That resentment is quiet, but it's growing. Even in uniform, the cracks show. A battalion from New Jersey refuses a transfer. A group from Nova Scotia fly its own regional banner before battle. Officers send reports back to London with carefully chosen words. Morale concerns, unit cohesion, unusual sentiment. No one says rebellion, not yet. But they don't say unity either, and those reading the reports know what they mean. These are not the same colonies as in previous wars. They are more educated, more crowded, more aware of themselves as something distinct. The war doesn't erase that. It sharpens it. And when they return, those who do, it is not to parades. It is to silence, to injury, to memory. They walk differently. They speak more carefully. Some never speak of it at all. But when they sit in quiet bars or gather behind closed doors, the question comes again. What did we fight for? The answers vary. Some say honor. Some say loyalty. But others, more and more, say nothing. They just shake their heads. Because deep down they know. They went to prove something, to be part of something. But what they returned to was still a colony, still ruled by strangers, still asked to obey, not to decide. And that realization lingers, in letters, in silences, in the space between footsteps on streets paved with British stone. 1919, and the men come home, but they do not come back the same. They walk with a stiffness that has nothing to do with age. Their eyes scan buildings and rooftops, even when they know there's no threat. They don't speak much at first, not about the trenches or the orders or the friends they left behind. But the silence is heavy. It hangs in barbershops and church pews, in supper tables and railway cars. Something fundamental has shifted. They left as subjects. They return as something else, not citizens, not yet, but no longer willing to kneel without question. Their uniforms don't fit anymore, not because they've changed shape, but because the war has changed what it means to wear one. No medals were handed out in the ports when they disembarked. No grand parades greeted the ships. Just paperwork, just a paycheck. Just the same taxes, the same rules, the same men in London giving orders from far away. The empire expected gratitude. Instead, it found resistance. Quiet at first, but steady. These men had killed. These men had bled. And now they asked, for what? For who? They start to gather, not in secret, not yet, but with purpose. In factories, in union halls, in the backs of bookstores. One meeting turns into 10, 10 into 100. Flyers appear, at first unsigned, later bearing the names of the returned. They are not calling for blood. They are not calling for war. They are asking questions, the same ones they asked in mud and gas and fire. Why are we governed from afar? Why are our children taught to serve, not to lead? Why do we feed an empire that forgets our names? The protests are small at first. A dozen men outside a courthouse in Boston. A silent march in Charleston. But they grow. Women join. Ministers speak. The names of the dead are read aloud. Not to glorify, but to remind. And the signs say respect, dignity, voice. The language is careful, legal, patient. But the message is clear. They are done being silent. The empire watches, uncertain. These are not rebels. These are soldiers. Loyal once, but now dangerous in a new way, because they do not speak of violence. They speak of rights, and they speak together. Some in power suggest concessions. Others call for crackdowns. Troops are moved. Assemblies are watched. Newspapers are warned. But the protests continue. No torches, no weapons, just voices. Trains stop running for a day in Pennsylvania. Dock workers in Savannah refuse shipments marked with the crown. A school in Ohio replaces its official textbooks with hand-printed copies of banned pamphlets. And through it all, the veterans lead, not shouting, not threatening, just standing, unmoved. Something deeper is happening. It's not revolution, not yet. But it's not loyalty either. It's the beginning of something that can't be reversed. Because once a man has fought and returned, once he has questioned the reason for his sacrifice and found no answer, he does not go back to quiet obedience. Not easily, not ever. The empire feels it. The cities feel it. And the veterans, the quiet ones, the broken ones, the ones who buried friends in France, they feel it most of all. Something is ending, and something else has already begun. 1926, and the assembly speaks louder than ever before. For decades, it had been a symbol, a chamber with chairs but no teeth, permitted to meet, to debate, to recommend, but never to decide. It had been enough once. Enough to keep the unrest measured, to give the illusion of participation. But after the war, after the protests, after the growing sense that British America was not merely a colony, but something different, something restless, the assembly begins to push. Not for independence, not yet, but for the right to govern its own money. It begins with a motion, carefully worded, politely framed, a request that the colonies be allowed to draft and manage their own internal budgets. Not foreign policy, not military spending, just roads, schools, taxes, the daily machinery of life. The empire hesitates. They sense the momentum. Finance is power, and power, once handed down, rarely returns upward. But refusing outright would risk further descent. And so a compromise is offered. Local budgets, yes, but subject to review. Taxation rights, yes, but limited in scope. A taste of autonomy, but nothing more. The decision is announced with cautious ceremony. Headlines in London praise the Crown's flexibility. Local papers frame it as a step forward. In the assembly, members give speeches filled with hope and restraint. No one calls it a victory. But everyone knows it is. Because for the first time since the revolution failed, British America has control over something. Not everything. Not enough. But something. Town councils begin drafting new budgets. Local taxes are adjusted. Funds are allocated for public services that had long gone underfunded. Schools open. Roads are repaired. And for once, the orders come not from across the ocean, but from within. The response among the people is subtle but profound. There are no parades, no fireworks, but in coffee shops and train stations, in factories and courthouses, there is a shift in tone. A growing belief that things can change, not through rebellion, but through persistence. Men who once marched in protest now run for office in the assembly. Women organize budget hearings in their communities. The machinery of empire begins to creak under the weight of these tiny local decisions. Not because they are revolutionary, but because they are chosen. London watches. At first, with mild amusement, then with discomfort, because what was meant to placate begins to awaken. Each tax passed locally is a reminder that authority can be grown, not just granted. Each successful infrastructure project becomes a quiet question. If we can build our own cities, why not our own future? The assembly, once decorative, now debates seriously. It does not yet have the power to defy the empire, but it has the power to ask, why not? And in that question lies the seed of everything to come. 1931, and the world collapses inward, not with bombs or armies, but with silence, with numbers falling and shelves emptying, with banks locking their doors and men standing in lines that stretch around city blocks. The Great Depression doesn't spare British America. It arrives like winter, quiet, suffocating, inescapable. One by one, factories close, wages vanish, families live on bread and water if they're lucky, And through it all, the empire keeps its voice measured, its promises distant. At first there is trust, or at least endurance. The memory of war, of discipline, of keep calm and carry on still lingers. People hope this will pass, that the crown will intervene, and it does, but not where they expect. Emergency loans are dispatched, but they don't reach the streets. They reach the banks. London's priority is stability, not sustenance. Financial houses are protected. Currency is stabilized. But none of that fills an empty stomach. None of that pays rent on a boarded-up apartment. None of that brings heat to the tenements when winter comes early and fierce. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, the mood begins to shift. Bread lines grow longer. Soup kitchens overflow. Men who once wore uniforms now wear signs around their necks that read, "We'll work for food." Children are pulled from school. Women take night shifts in candlelit laundries. And all the while, Parliament issues statements from across the sea about fiscal responsibility and imperial resilience. In the Assembly, members plead for greater relief and are met with silence. The disconnect becomes unbearable. Trust fractures, and from that fracture, something older emerges: rage. The protests begin as marches, peaceful, measured, petitioning for aid, for jobs, for a future. But they are met with cold eyes and police lines, rubber batons, tear gas, and something in the people breaks. In the autumn of that year, the first general strikes are declared. Rail workers refuse to move goods. Dock hands blockade the ports. Newspaper printers halt production, and teachers lock their classroom doors. Cities grind to a halt. Not out of violence, but out of refusal. The people do not want to destroy. They simply will not continue. The empire calls it disorder, rebellion in disguise. And maybe it is, but not in the way they mean. There are no flags, no declarations, just hunger and exhaustion turned into defiance. For the first time since the revolution failed, British America speaks not through speeches, but through silence, through stillness, through streets so quiet they feel like tombs. And for a moment, just a moment, London listens, not out of empathy, but out of fear. Because a nation that no longer shouts, but no longer obeys, that is harder to control than one in open revolt. 1939, and the world marches again. The names are different, the faces a generation younger, but the rhythm is the same. Posters go up overnight. Newspapers change their headlines. The word war returns, this time not whispered but blared over radios and shouted in town halls. British America, though still without a flag of its own, is once again asked to bleed for a crown thousands of miles away. The call is not polite. It is loud, urgent, and repeated until it echoes in every school and every church. Duty, honor, loyalty, words spoken by men in suits who will never see a trench. The draft is swift. Young men from factory towns and farming counties find themselves given numbers, not names. There's little time for training. Some shoot a rifle once before boarding the ship. Others are handed uniforms that don't fit, helmets that dent too easily, boots too thin for the mud they'll sink in. But speed matters more than preparation. The empire is at risk, they're told. And when the empire is at risk, the colonies must prove their worth. That's always been the deal. One-sided, unspoken, binding. Mothers cry quietly. Fathers pretend to be proud. Girls wave at departing trains with forced smiles. In cities like Cleveland, Savannah, Montreal, Charleston, processions of soldiers wind through streets that look too normal for war. People drop leaflets from windows, urging calm. Priests bless lines of boys too young to shave. And everywhere, the same voice plays on every radio. This is your duty. This is your moment for king and empire. But no one says what the war is really for. Not to the ones who will fight it. The speeches mention liberty, but not whose. They mention tyranny, but not at home. The war feels far away at first. France, Poland, North Africa, names on a map. But the body bags bring it close. Letters arrive, written in mud and sweat. Some are returned unopened. Others are kept folded in drawers, read until the ink fades. And what they say is always the same: confusion, fear, orders that make no sense, battles fought for hills no one wants, allies who don't speak the language, enemies who die just as scared. Through all of it, there is a question pulsing beneath every word. Why? But it's never written. That question is too dangerous. At home, the streets empty. Women fill the factories. Children run errands their fathers once did. Rationing begins. Spies are rumored. Radios are monitored. Anything that smells of dissent is questioned. Songs about Colombia vanish from pubs and parlors. Assemblies meet in private, afraid of saying too much. British America is not just at war abroad. It is watching itself, policing itself, holding its breath, and the silence grows louder than any anthem. Yet the sacrifices continue. Year after year, thousands lost, then tens of thousands, and still the orders come. Still the ships leave. Still the names are read in churches, week after week. And for all the blood, there is no clarity. The front keeps shifting. The goals keep changing. Victory becomes a word with no meaning. And for many, the war stops being something they serve in. It becomes something they endure, something they survive, something they will never forgive. Because by the time the war finally begins to turn, when victory is whispered as a possibility, the men who left are no longer the boys who boarded the ships. They are colder, quieter. And when they return, if they return, they will bring with them more than wounds. They will bring questions, and this time they will demand answers. 1946. And the silence is heavier than the victory. Soldiers come home not to parades, but to questions. The towns they left are older, wearier, and so are they. The medals mean less than they thought. The streets feel smaller. The speeches feel hollow. And the faces of the men returning from Europe and the Pacific carry something deeper than pride. They carry disappointment. Not just in what they saw or what they lost, but in what they returned to. There were no promises waiting, no vision of change, only a resumption of the old order, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing had been paid. It begins in whispers, in the spaces between church pews and bar stools, in waiting rooms and train stations. The idea, maybe British America should ask for more. Not independence, not yet. But equality, recognition, a voice. Something more than conscription and taxation. Something more than orders barked from London. The men who bled for the empire start to ask if the empire will ever bleed for them. Some write letters, others organize. They aren't radicals. They wear uniforms. They carry scars. Their loyalty was never in question, until now. The Committee for Confederation forms not in secret, but in the open. Veterans, clergy, teachers, local officials, men and women who want a new contract, not a revolution. They speak of a shared crown, a shared burden. They invoke Canada, Australia, New Zealand, dominions with voices. The committee calls for a structure where British America is not simply administered, but heard, where laws are not passed over the ocean, where taxes are explained, where the children of Boston and Savannah do not have to die for decisions made by men they will never meet. The reaction from London is not harsh, it is absent. Requests go unanswered. Petitions are ignored. Speeches are dismissed as premature. The press downplays the movement. Governors are told to be patient, not generous. It is not the refusal that stings, but the silence. A silence that says, "You are still not part of this conversation." The same silence that came before the war, during the war, and now, after the war, unbroken. It is as if their sacrifice changed nothing. And for many, that truth burns hotter than any battlefield memory. But the committee does not dissolve. It grows, slowly, carefully, with discipline. Meetings are recorded. Demands are reasonable. The word rebellion is never spoken. Still, suspicion creeps in. British officials begin to monitor attendees. Some veterans lose their pensions without explanation. A few journalists are warned. But nothing is declared, nothing official. Just pressure. Just air that gets colder around the committee. And in that chill, a second question begins to form, quieter than the first. If not now, when? And more dangerously, if not like this, then how? 1952, and the ground doesn't shake, but it shifts. Not with rifles, not with flags, but with silence, with refusals, with absences. In Norfolk, trains stop running. Not all at once, just delays, complications, absences. In Ohio, coal deliveries miss their schedules, though no one claims sabotage. In Georgia, teachers stop reading from the official history. They do not burn the books. They close them and speak from memory instead. No manifesto, no declaration, just a pattern of things once done that are now left undone. The empire begins to feel heavier, not because it has changed, but because fewer people are choosing to carry it. There are no front lines, no famous names, no single cause to point to and crush. What begins as civil disobedience is not even called that. Not yet. Officials label it disorganization, mismanagement, temporary breakdowns. But the breakdowns continue. In lumberyards, in ports, in classrooms. The empire tries to respond with policies, guidelines, and investigations. None of it works. Not because the people resist directly, but because they don't answer. They don't explain. They don't gather in protest. They simply go another way, as if something had been lifted, not from above, but from within. What is undone is not just loyalty. It is rhythm, identity. The idea that a farmer in Connecticut shares something deep with a banker in Bristol. That idea fades without speeches, without banners. In its place, small choices, quiet shifts. Some communities stop holding coronation parades. Others stop attending royal holidays. Children grow up never hearing "God Save the Queen" sung with meaning. The decline is cultural before it is political. But in empires, Culture is politics, and the absence of ritual begins to read like rejection. British authorities find themselves chasing shadows. They try to reinforce loyalty with ceremony, invest more in education, return to local governance. But the trust is gone. It's not hostility that spreads, it's indifference. The kind that cannot be arrested, cannot be threatened, cannot be reasoned with. The kind that leaves leaflets unread, orders unanswered, and flags unraised. When London looks to the colonies, it sees a place still functioning, but no longer listening. The maps are unchanged. The names are still British. But underneath it all, something has slipped, something foundational, and it does not come back. 1957, and the empire lets go, but not with grace, not with celebration, not with apology. It does so with paperwork, with delay, and with clauses written in a language that feels more like retreat than resolution. The act of transfer is signed in London, not Philadelphia. It is drafted by ministers, not citizens. And it does not say the word independence. It speaks instead of administrative realignment, of regional autonomy, of shared governance structures. The words are cold, distant, written not to inspire, but to manage. Yet when the ink dries, the structure shifts. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, decisions will be made on this side of the ocean. Not all, not freely, but enough to feel the difference. The transition is not uniform. Some cities embrace it, opening offices, drafting charters, holding elections that feel halfway real. Others resist, unsure whether this is a gift or a trap. Loyalists call it a betrayal. Radicals call it a half measure. Most people simply wait. The memory of silence runs deep. They remember what was promised before and what was taken. So the response is cautious. Committees form slowly. Councils meet in modest buildings. Flags are not replaced, only lowered. There are no fireworks, just longer meetings and uncertain applause. The transition government calls itself temporary, but its decisions begin to matter. Roads are repaired. Taxes are shifted. Education is quietly rewritten, not by decree, but through new appointments, new priorities. London watches closely. It keeps advisors in place, funds select programs, maintains military assets on coastal bases. The message is clear. The leash has slackened, not disappeared. But the posture has changed. No longer rulers, the British become observers, consultants, voices across the sea whose volume fades with each passing month. Their concern is global now. Oil, Asia, Europe, and what once was the empire's centerpiece is now a liability too expensive to micromanage. The rhetoric of unity persists, but even the most optimistic speeches feel hollow. The empire, as a system, remains, but as a presence, it recedes, and that absence, more than any act, becomes the beginning of something else. In homes and schools and offices, people begin to speak differently, not of rebellion, not of revenge, but of structure, of what might come next. The name Columbia returns, not as a myth, but as a question. Could there be a country here? Not a colony, not a dependency, something else. It is not shouted in the streets. It is written in minutes, in drafts, in quiet conversations after long meetings. The transition government does not endorse this idea, but it does not suppress it either. Its own legitimacy is borrowed, and everyone knows it. So the words grow, not as slogans, but as seeds, not of freedom, but of self. And for the first time in generations, the people of British America begin to imagine what they are, not as subjects, but as authors. 1959, and the map changes. No cannon fire, no parades, no declarations printed on parchment, just a press conference, a few signatures, and a line of type added to atlases around the world. The Colombian Federation, a name once whispered in defiance, now spoken plainly in bureaucratic circles, stamped on customs forms and typed onto passports. There is no revolutionary anthem, no sacred founding text, only a framework, a charter passed in parts, debated across a dozen districts, shaped more by compromise than conviction. It's not born of triumph, it's born of necessity. The empire has stepped back, the people have stepped forward. Not in unity, not yet, but with enough shared momentum to matter. In the new capital, a city chosen not for glory, but for neutrality, the first session of the Federal Council meets. The delegates arrive not as heroes, but as administrators. Former provincial governors, labor representatives, educators, even clergy. Few wear suits, most speak slowly. The atmosphere is tense but focused. There is little appetite for ideology. They speak instead of water rights, tax codes, road maintenance, border delineation. The debates are long, the tempers controlled. This is not a revolutionary vanguard. It is something more durable. A coalition of the tired. Tired of waiting, of obeying, of explaining themselves to men 3,000 miles away. They don't speak of vengeance. They speak of weather systems, of postal networks, of power grids. It is dull, it is deliberate, and it is working. Outside, the response is cautious. There are no mass celebrations, but there is movement, in small ways. Flags are stitched with new colors. Storefronts replace the Queen's portrait with regional emblems. Schools begin morning assemblies with a moment of silence instead of an oath. Newspapers use the word nation, still tentative, but more frequently. And in factories and ports and rural councils, people begin to write down what they need. Not what they dream of, but what they demand. Clean water, fair wages, safe roads, medical clinics. The language of politics shifts, not towards abstract liberty, but towards manageable expectations. A future not of grandeur, but of grounding. Colombia is not a flame, it is a foundation. London sends a letter. It uses the word respect. It does not use the word independent. The transition is complete, they say, and they wish the new federation well. There is no recognition ceremony, no envoy, just silence. Official, final, and perhaps for the best. The Federation doesn't reply. It simply continues. The Council expands. Regional governments solidify. Courts are formed. Disputes are resolved, not perfectly, but internally. For the first time in anyone's memory, decisions belong here. And while no one knows what the next year holds or the next 10, there is now a structure for the asking. Not for power, but for participation. The Colombian Federation is not a revolution fulfilled. It is a gap filled, a wound closed, a people deciding, without permission, to become real. 1960, and a flag rises over the capital, slowly, without fanfare. There are no crowds, no anthem, no brass band, no cannon salute, just fabric catching the wind above a building of gray stone, and a few bystanders who stop to watch in silence. The sky is overcast. The moment comes and passes like any other, but it's done. The colors are different now. They don't carry a monarch's seal. They don't need one. This is not a celebration. It's a signal that something has changed, or perhaps settled, and that the long process of becoming is now complete. The flag flies. No one salutes. And yet, it stays. Inside, the first printed copy of the new Constitution is laid on a table. It is plain. There are no flourishes, no language invoking providence or divine right. Just laws, procedures, definitions. It's a document about function, not faith. It outlines representation, finance, defense, trade. It does not promise greatness. It promises order. There are sections on natural resources, on judicial review, on the role of municipalities. The word citizen appears over 200 times. The word freedom appears less than 10, and that is not an accident. This is a charter not for a utopia, but for a nation that has seen what dreams cost when they are pursued without caution. It is not sacred. It is not perfect. It is theirs. Outside the capital, people go about their day. In some places, the flag is raised. In others, it isn't. A few towns hold small gatherings, usually in schoolyards or church halls. No fireworks, no speeches. A teacher reads aloud from the Constitution to a dozen students. A retired postal worker pins a paper emblem to his jacket. In one town, a teenager sketches the new flag in chalk on the sidewalk. Then the wind comes, and the chalk fades. But the memory doesn't. In factories and farms, the day is ordinary, and yet different. Because now, when someone writes a letter, it no longer goes through London. Because now, when a town needs a road repaired, it petitions its own. These things matter, slowly, subtly, deeply. Years later, people will argue over the date. Some will say independence began in the factories, others in the war, others still with the first whisper of the word Columbia. But for most, this is the moment they will remember, not because it was grand, but because it was final. Not because it was loud, but because it was theirs. No empire fell. No king fled. There was no blood, no martyr, no sacred hill. Only a document signed, a flag raised, and a quiet understanding passed between neighbors. That, from this point forward, they are not waiting. They are not requesting. They are not rebelling. They are simply living under their own name. The Colombian Federation exists, not as a dream, not as a hope, but as a country.